So once again, this is Diego Caleiro. I am the director of the Institute Ethics, Rationality and Future of Humanity in São Paulo, Brazil. And this is my vlog entry. My vlog is called Fearless Focus. And now I'm going to talk about the philosophical assumptions that are going to be present in the following videos that you might be interested in watching. So this video, together with the previous video in which I described other assumptions that I'm going to be taking for granted, are the only two videos that you actually have to watch, and from now on you can pretty much get whatever interests you the best according to topic and description. So let's take a look at some philosophical assumptions. I'm going to talk about two topics most generally. Those topics are philosophy of mind and ethics. So let's start with a little bit of philosophy of mind. I take a general Dennetian stance in philosophy of mind. That means I agree with the philosopher called Daniel Dennett. Dennett mostly considers that thinking is done through analogies, that intuition pumps, that is, ways in which to make people more prone to having particular intuitions, are interesting philosophical tools. And that most, if not all, of the discussions relating, for instance, to the mind-body duality and to consciousness and to qualia and other relevant discussions relating to mental entities are to be substituted by different discussions in which you discuss, for instance, not the level of reality that consciousness has, but if consciousness is as real as a particular thing, say time, or a concept such as mainframe, or is the level of reality higher or lower than the level of reality of a bed? What about the value of reality of myself? What about the value of reality of solipsism? So you take a comparison instead of just trying to use terms such as existence and reality as if their values were clearly known and as if everyone knew the meaning of those terms. So that's something that I'm not going to be doing in general. I'm not going to be using the terms existence, I'm not going to be using reality, because it's quite unclear at this point in the history of philosophy. What do those terms actually mean? So in as much as we can taboo those words, and tabooing words is also a philosophical assumption that I'm going to be using here, it is desirable to do so. To taboo a word means that we're going to avoid using this word in our reasoning, so that if we have a concept that we do not have a clear grasp on, say for instance consciousness, we either are going to substitute the concept with the substance, avoiding talking past each other, for instance, or we're going to figure out that the concept did not relate to anything in the world in the first place, in which case it should be eliminated. I'm not saying that consciousness is supposed to be eliminated. I actually think that consciousness is a mongrel concept, which means it contains several distinct meanings that people apply in different contexts, and some people only use some of those meanings, some people use others of those meanings. Thus, any conversation using the word consciousness is going to be clearly unlikely to end up in a very good place unless we either taboo consciousness or use subscripts such as, oh, consciousness for such and such person, or consciousness for such and such person, according to their particular description of what consciousness is. This is, of course, a cognitively daunting task for one's brain to map a particular concept as it is thought of by different folks This is one of the things that philosophers specialize in doing, and I will try to avoid it in as much as I'm not going to have time enough to describe concepts according to specific people all the time. So what else am I going to be assuming about the mind? I'm not going to clearly distinguish philosophy of mind from other sciences of the mind. So I'm just going to talk about the mind generally and which assumptions I'm going to be taking regarding the mind in general. First and foremost, it seems to me that George Ainsley's theory about Piconomics is fundamentally correct. And his theory describes a conflict of interest between selves that are interested in, say, whatever it is that I'm going to be doing in 10 minutes, what I'm going to be doing in an hour, what I'm going to be doing in 10 years, or what I'm going to be doing in 100 years if I ever live that much. So according to Ainsley, what we have is a systematic conflict between different parts of our minds, different modules, if you will, that try to get their best payoff, their best reward for whatever it is that they think of as themselves or theirs. So when I choose to compose a piano song, I'm not thinking specifically about my current instantaneous self. I'm also not very interested in what myself is going to be doing in the next 20 minutes. I'm probably just paying a big favor for a future self which is going to have an eureka moment, feeling like, oh my goodness, I created this. And also to even further distance in the future self, which is going to rejoice the pleasures of having composed such a thing and maybe the status that might come out of it or something along those lines. So what is the structure of our interest in those particular segments of ourselves? According to the Ainsleyan theory, this structure is hyperbolic. What does that mean? It means that the amount of importance that our minds give to a particular moment in time or a particular event that is going to happen increases hyperbolically with time. So what does that matter? I mean, why would we care about what is the shape of the curve of how interested we are in something? So let me try to draw that for you. If we have an exponential curve which has an ending on a moment in which I, for instance, played a piano in a concert for a lot of people, then as I approach this particular moment, this moment becomes more important and I dedicate more resources and more effort to it. It is also going to be considered as more pleasurable, and I try to foresee what is going to happen in that particular event. So if you had an exponential curve in that particular regard, then if you have an exponential curve which describes how much I like my piano presentation, then the value I give to it was going to improve as it was approached. But if there was a previous action which had a smaller value at a particular point, so if it was smaller than value that at that point in the curve the piano presentation would have, like the future piano presentation would have, then this point would also create a curve that is going to be diminishing towards the back of time. So if I'm going in this particular direction, then you have several different curves. Those curves are going to represent how interesting something is to me. And if they were all exponential, and you just have to believe me on this one, they would not cross one another. Now, if they are hyperbolic, on the other hand, so for instance, if I would like to take a doses of beer before in the very night before I play, then even though the beer might be very costly to the thing that is going to be more pleasurable in the end, there is a point in time as you approach it in which the lines cross. So you have an importance line which is hyperbolic like this, and then you have another hyperbolic line which is hyperbolic like this. So there is a point in which those two lines cross. What does that mean? It means that if I'm walking in this direction and I get to the point where they cross and I surpass this point, but not before the time in which I could have the beer, the value of the beer is going to appear as subjectively higher than the value that the future concert has. So if one of those activities is able to obstruct the other, it will do so because our motivation is going to be very intense at this particular point to take the beer. So what do we have here? We have an internal conflict of how mind is working, which states that at those particular points in time, you're going to be more interested in the beer, even though in a more complete sense of value, which takes the whole of you into account, you would prefer to be able to play the piano with more accuracy, perfection, and emotion, which you might not be able to do if you have enough beers not to be able to perform that well. So this is a very short explanation of what Piconomics is. I suggest taking a look at Wikipedia if that interests you. And I generally think that this happens to us, and this is the way in which our minds were shaped by several distinct evolutionary processes. Some people are going to have a more curvy hyperbolic discounting. This is called hyperbolic discounting, by the way. Some people are going to have more hyperbolic discounting. That means that they're going to be a little bit more anxious. They're going to be more prone to doing things that are very pleasurable at a specific moment, but either risky or obstructing their values in the long term. So those people are going to be more likely, for instance, if they ever experiment them, to get addicted to drugs or to sex, gambling, or any other activity that might cause what we call addiction. So in addiction, you basically have a pattern in which those hyperbolic curves, which are smaller and less important to you as a whole, are going to be always taking the place of something else that is higher in your scale of value. But as your self approaches that particular point in time, you feel prone to actually doing those things, and you end up doing them, and your future self suffers, your present self gains, and I'm not going to state in particular that one or the other is best here. I also subscribe to a theory which I don't know if it has been majorly defended by anyone in particular, but I think that we are composed of several different longitudes of temporal self. What does that mean? So let's assume that there is a pyramid here in my back. So if you have a pyramid here, then I consider it to be the case that I am not only my instantaneous self, as a Buddhist would like, nor am I the self that is composed of my 3 seconds experience, as a cognitive neuroscientist would probably enjoy, nor am I the subject of the very last, say, 1 minute, as a positive psychology might beep me into asking how happy I feel, nor am I the subjective assessment that I have about a whole year of my life. So I can judge my life this year to be an 8, I can judge my instantaneous pleasure to be a 4, I can judge my 10-second pleasure to be 5, and so on and so forth. And it seems to me to be the case that many people, especially within rationality bounded circles, are prone to thinking that one of those is and has to be the most important one of the things that constitutes us. So they're likely to either go for the extremely long one or for the extremely short one. The extremely short version is going to lead someone into some form of hedonism, whereas if you take the very long-term stance, then you're going to end up becoming something that does not have a specific name, but let's call it an infinitarian. So an infinitarian is a person that cares first and foremost, that values first and foremost whatever it is that happens to them across their entire lifetime, or if you want to go even further, whatever happens related to their actions across the entirety of their lives in the universe for as long as time lasts. I think that those two views are incomplete, and probably we could also describe them as wrong in that regard. It seems to me that we are composed of all the processes that are being undergone in our brain, conscious or unconscious, and the fact that some of those processes are going to be more salient at times, like the instantaneous self is going to be more salient when you feel like eating chocolate. The very long-term self is going to be more important when you consider whether you should or not pursue a pension. Then I think it is the case that we should give value to all of those. We should consider all of those valuable parts of us, and we should consider them, their wills and desires, as constituting whatever we are made of. So this is also consistent with a particular theory called neurodarwinism, in which you have cortical columns and brain activity in general in several different strings. All those strings are fighting as if they were competing for resources. Those resources end up being, for instance, the focus of attention, which is going to be at the topic of fearless focus very frequently, or also it could be the focus of consciousness. So I am not a particular subscriber of neurodarwinism, especially because I don't know the details of the theory in very specifics, but I do like an analogy. So once again, coming back to the Dennetian stance on thinking about things, I'm going to propose an analogy, which is an intuition pun, for how one should think about the mind. And the analogy is an analogy with politics. So you take all the cortical columns, you take all the activity that's going in the brain, you can think of it conceptually, you can think of it physically, you can think of different strands fighting against each other in whichever model representation of the undergoings of our minds that you have. But okay, so take whichever ways in which you think that those distinct processes constitute what ends up going to our deliberative processes and our frontal lobes and our attention and, if you will, our consciousness. Okay, you have these structures, and neurodarwinism is going to say that they fight against each other. If you take the analogy for politics, then you can consider that those structures are people that are involved in politics. They're going to end up forming coalitions, because coalitions are sufficiently stronger. Those coalitions will become what we call in politics parties. And if you have a few parties that are fighting for your locus of attention or consciousness, you're going to end up having, say, one elect president or one elect prime minister for most of the times. You might have a very controversial or complicated election in which 2 people or 3 people are going to acquire as much power as one another. So the analogy goes more or less like this. If you take each single person as something that you're perceiving, as a potential sentence that you might emit after that, as a particular string of thought that you might pursue, then you have those strings of thought fighting in parallel somewhere within your brain. And those who form the better coalitions and whose strength is sufficiently more consistent, are going to be the ones that are bumped into the next layer. So the next layer is going to contain more accurate information about fewer processes, and this process goes on and on until you have some sort of winner, and this winner is what we call our string of consciousness, or in this particular case in which I'm talking to you, it is the deliberative string of words that I'm actually ending up emitting, even though I had not planned previously what I was going to say. So this model is a model in which you have different strings of thoughts fighting one another. It is a descendant of the multiple drafts model that was developed by Dennett, and now I cannot recall the name of the person that suggested this political analogy. So one of the assumptions that I'm going to be taking for granted here is that our mind is a mix of those three things that I've just described earlier, and also a bunch of other things. So the economic view is that there are several different distinct individuals that are fighting for their importance in time, and the entity that arises out of that, that is the complex me that goes through during time, is something that contains all of them, and if you distribute their desires and interests, you get a hyperbolic discounting theory. I also think that the pyramid analogy for what we are composed of in terms of time segments and how lengthy those time segments are is a good analogy. And finally, to choose which processes that go on in our brains, in our minds, that actually end up being the focus of our attention, I subscribe to the analogy of politics, in which you have different coalitions, and those coalitions end up creating either a winner or a very small subset of winners. For instance, in the case in which you say something with your mouth but sign something different with your hand, this is a case in which two different winners have at the same time managed to get control of your motor behavior. And it is a funny and interesting fact that this happens. So all of this is several different ways in which I'm dividing an intelligent entity into non-intelligent entities. And I think this is the way to go in terms of psychology. I agree with Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind. And of course I prefer his The Emotion Machine, which is a 2007 book that I recommend everyone reads. I'm going to talk a little bit about it eventually. And a good thing to think about is that there are several distinct different theories, but the one thing that they all have in common is that you have this mental entity that is composed either of smaller mental structures or of non-mental structures at all. So in order to do what we call psychology, in order to do cognitive science, and also in order to do artificial intelligence, what you end up having to do is to make non-intelligent things perform as if they were intelligent. And it seems to be the case that evolution has done the service for us, and we should definitely be thankful for that, even though the vast majority of things that evolution did for us might be things that we should consider not reasons to be proud of. So what else about mind? I'm not going to take a particular stance on the monism-dualism debate. I think that for all its importance, it is not going to be solved very soon. So sometimes I'm going to be talking about what both positions should think about. But most of the times I'm just going to be doing what Dennett does and using analogies and declaring degrees of reality by comparison, as opposed to saying what exists and what doesn't. As a final note on ways in which I think about the mind, I like Minsky's theory about how emotions work, in which you have imagine just a bunch of clouds here, and you have all those clouds as being a specific resource. Of course, those resources are going to be composed of smaller things that are non-mental, but you have all those resources, and an emotion, say fear, is going to activate some of the resources and deactivate most of the other resources. So if a lion comes up here, I'm going to be a little bit less focused in continuing this video presentation in a way that is understandable, and a little bit more focused in figuring out whether the distance between my window and the floor is sufficiently large that that I'm better off fighting against the lion than jumping out the window. So basically, that's one of the ways in which you can think of emotion. This is a descriptive way in which you can describe how emotions are actually activations of resources. That doesn't mean I subscribe to that as being the only way in which you can explain emotions. It's definitely not the best way to explain emotions from a first-person perspective, and it also does not account for the evolutionary purposes that have shaped the emotions in the first place. It is just a descriptive account, which I think does very well the job of describing what emotion entails in terms of changes in the brain and how the brain moves and stops doing things. Finally, I should stop saying finally because this video is supposed to be long and I'm supposed to speak for as long as I have information to give. So there's also Jeff Hawkins' theory of how the mind works. It is called the memory prediction framework. And according to the memory prediction framework, we are basically prediction machines, and the way in which our brains work is by predicting how the world is going to be, as opposed to intaking all the information from the actual world. This is definitely seconded by an absurdly large amount of experiments coming from cognitive science, cognitive neuroscience, and other fields, which definitely agree that a large amount of our perceptions is not a direct consequence of our interaction with the environment around us. It is a secondary interpretation that our brain is already pre-developed into interpreting about what is going on around us. So this is particularly true for perception, visual perception, tactile perception. So one interesting experiment is one in which you have a machine that touches you 3 times here, 3 times here, and 3 times here, and instead of feeling that particular thing, you feel like something is crawling up your arm. So why do you do that? Because you're pre-programmed to feel things as they would be more evolutionarily relevant for you. So your nervous system and your brain are both engineered in such way that they prefer to be mistaken about where the touches were, as long as if it was actually a scorpion, then you could just smash the scorpion away and not have to wait for the time to cognitively process that it is a machine, because there were not so many machines in the savannas and in the other areas in which we evolved, such as the 16th century or whatever was happening to us, say, 100,000 years before we were in the savannas. Back to philosophy of mind. About beliefs. I take the following stance on beliefs. I do not think that beliefs are sentences in the brain. It seems to me that beliefs are forms of correlation that can or cannot be activated according to contextual features. Beliefs are, in a way, proportionalities between the internal contents of my brain and the contents of the world around me. So if I hold the belief that I have a dog, which I don't, then that means that there is a process that is happening in my brain which would highly correlate with something wagging a tail to me every time I said its name. And this is the general form which a belief takes. It is good to differentiate, and this is something philosophers do a lot, between beliefs and opinions. A belief is something that you think about the world regardless of it being stated in linguistic terms. So I may hold the belief that someone is, say, fat, even though I have never said that or even consciously thought of it. An opinion, on the other hand, is something that it can linguistically express. So a dog can have beliefs, but a dog cannot have opinions because dogs do not possess languages. In general, opinions are thought of as having a truth value, so you consider that something is true or something is false. Once again, I have to remind you that I am a Bayesian, and therefore I think that when I say true, what I mean is that I'm more than 80% sure, and sometimes I mean contextually even 95% sure or more, that that particular thing is true. And when I say something is false, I'm saying in general something along the lines of it's less than 10% likely that this is true. So this gives you some description of background notions which I'll be taking for granted as ways to describe the mind, and I think this video is sufficiently big that I'm going to leave my philosophical assumptions regarding ethics to a next video, which is bad because in the beginning of this video I said that you only have to watch 2 videos, but it now seems that you have to watch 3 of them before going to whichever topic interests you the most, while at the same time knowing what is the background view of the author of those videos. So, I'll see you soon.